Well, a very warm welcome to the latest edition of Generation, our podcast produced by Generation, which is the mission arm of the Free Church of Scotland, where we speak to folk really from Scotland and all around the world about mission. And of course, mission famously is from everywhere to everywhere. And today I've got a colleague and a friend with me, David MacPherson. David is the executive director of, and you have to excuse my Spanish, Operación San Andrés. David, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, Operación San Andrés, or OSA, is quite new to many of our listeners and viewers. Can you just describe what it is?
Yeah, so OSA, let's just call it OSA. I think that's easier. So OSA is a charity, a Christian non-profit that was founded about 15 years ago by a Peruvian doctor, but who is all his professional life lived in the States and still does, Dr. Campos. So he had a burden for helping the poor, basically, to put it at its simplest level, and had certain means to do so. He and others of the church that he was part of. And so he came to Peru, as I say, nearly 20 years ago, identified what at that time was one of the poorest parts of Lima, still is up to a point, and began a ministry of, I guess we could call it a diaconal ministry, reaching out to the children and the families of that community.
Okay, I read a really incredible thing that it was in 1961 when he was a pupil at school. He wrote an essay called The Slum. Do you know that story?
Yes, I do. Yes, and it's interesting because the kind of the inspiration behind that was Sam Will, who was a Free Church missionary in the school. So he was really mentoring in a way the senior pupils, trying to awaken in them a social Christian conscience. Largely, the pupils would have been from middle class, some upper middle class families who had little exposure to the kind of poverty that there was in Lima. So yes, through Sam's encouragement, some of the pupils were given the opportunity to visit places like Coyique. It wasn't actually Coyique, but places like Coyique. And what arose out of that was this essay that Luis wrote, where he revealed that blossoming concern for responding to those situations.
Yes, I met Sam Will. I mean, some of the older listeners, those who are raised in the Free Church, will have known him. He was quite a character. I remember he had a monocle. He had quite a substantial beard, a better one than you have, David, I have to say. But did you ever meet him?
Yes, I did. And then, of course, in the congregation in Aberdeen, his sister Ellen Will is a long-standing member of the congregation. So there was a reconnection in a way because of that connection.
And isn't that a great illustration of how mission works? You get a British missionary goes and teaches in a school in Lima and inspires a national who goes on to help his own people. Any views on that?
I think I guess that's how mission works. That's how the church works. And I think it does illustrate the importance of those personal relationships. I think if Sam had given Luis a book about the poor, I can't imagine it would have had the same impact as Luis seeing in Sam that personal commitment and burden to reach out with Christ's love to people in those circumstances. So yeah, I think it is a kind of snapshot of what hopefully is happening all the time, everywhere.
Okay, was that a big change for you? Because most of your ministry has been church-based. You were a minister in Peru, and then you came to Scotland for a few years, and ministry, congregational pastoring, and now you're working with a third sector NGO. Was the change difficult?
It's certainly a big change, and it's probably the aspect of the change that I most wrestled with in terms of whether to take this on or not. I never had any issues of theology or principle that I was abandoning my ministry by doing this. That wasn't the issue. It's just the change and whether I was suited to something that was so different. I suppose during my time in Peru, though, I was indeed pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Moyobamba. The nature or the breadth of the ministry of that congregation was such that I was involved in a lot of project type activity, be it building projects or diaconal projects of one kind or another. So I guess that gave me a little bit of experience of some of what I'm involved in now. Also, the fundraising, the connecting with funders was something that I had some experience of during that previous spell in Peru.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're a really good organizer. That's someone that looks onto your ministry. You organise really well in Moyobamba and Bonaccord. You oversaw, quite dramatic change with the building project and a culture change. So, I think organisation is one of your things. Can you just tell us a little bit about the location of the ministry? It's in a little sort of suburb of Lima. Suburb is perhaps a little bit too posh, but can you outline what the area is like?
Yeah, so Coyique, where at the moment all of the ministry of OSA is focused and concentrated, is a community of about 200,000 people on the northern outskirts of Lima. So basically, once you start heading out of Lima, you begin to hit the foothills of the Andes, but the desert foothills of the Andes. So basically, you're on the northern outskirts of Lima in a, I guess, mountainous area, but desert hills. And I guess maybe 30 years ago, folks started populating that part of the city, or what became part of the city, and that has continued over the succeeding decades to this point where it is now. So basically, 30 years ago, it would have been a shanty town. Today, the older parts of Coyique would no longer be shanty towns. Pretty much all of Coyique would still be poor, but some parts considerably more poor than others. Basically, a rule of thumb is the higher up the mountain you go, the poorer the people are, and the newer the communities are. So yeah, that's more or less the where we're operating.
Okay, so what sort of ministries is OSA engaged in?
Right, so they're family focused. So probably the core activity that OSA has been involved in over the years is work with kids. So there's a primary school kids program that operates in 2 shifts, morning and afternoon. And all of these children, of course, are in public schools one end of the day, either in the morning or the afternoon. So the end of the day that they're not at school, they come to OSA. And what we try and do is give them not just help with homework, but alternative activities that focus on really formation of character and of preparation for life. So there's art and there's music and there's Christian education that the kids are involved with, and they're fed. So they have their lunchtime meal. So there's a nutrition element to that. As a result of that, we then made connections with obviously their parents, and particularly the mothers, largely because the mothers tend to be more accessible than the fathers, and have, as a result of that, got involved in work with mothers in the area of domestic violence, seeking to prevent domestic violence, and also in the area of income generation, which kind of is linked with the domestic violence, because part of the reason to give the mothers the capacity to have some independent means of income is that it gives them greater power to resist abusive situations, and indeed have the way of actually walking away if necessary. So around that, there have been other things that have also been done over the years. This past year has been unusual for obvious reasons. And so we've had to reinvent ourselves in terms of these regular programs. But we've also introduced an emergency support project, which has taken up quite a lot of my time and just at the time of the institution, which basically is around providing food to soup kitchens. Then one other thing to mention, which is important, is that out of the ministry of OSA has arisen a local Christian congregation called Light of Hope. The Women for Mission project very kindly supported the work of that congregation, or raise funds for the work of that congregation, funds that we'll be spending in the course of the next few months. So that it's kind of a strange relationship for me as a Presbyterian, because it's kind of it's a little independent church, which is really part of OSA. And that kind of model is a little bit unusual for me to kind of get my head around, but that's where it is at the moment.
Okay, would it go so far to describe it as kind of church planting, but by a different model? That's basically where it's going. The Light of Hope is in its very early stages. Do you see it as having that potential as a more kind of robust church with preaching?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah,
I think you could describe it as a church plant. It is a church plant. By any definition, it's a church plant. I suppose the concern would be, and being very honest, is that given that it has this financial backing of a charity that in the context is reasonably well resourced, there's the danger that it could be very difficult for it to become the church, for it to become financially independent, because there's always the backup of OSA to provide the financial means required. So that's just a concern. I'm not saying that dooms the project. One of the interesting things, actually, and on just following on in that line of questioning or that line of thought, is one of the interesting providential outcomes of the pandemic is that as we've provided support to, well, now it's about 30 soup kitchens in shanty towns across Coyique, that, as you can imagine, has created a lot of goodwill towards the organization. And that is opening doors for other opportunities for ministry, among them with the church. So tomorrow I will be going to Coyique. I'll be meeting up with the guy who's responsible for providing the food or the logistics for that. And then the two pastors, we've just taken on a new pastor, and we're going to be visiting 3 communities where we're looking to establish a foothold for the church work. So almost like satellite sites from the main mother church that is currently functioning.
Okay, before we go back and talk about church, I was really interested in the micro enterprise work. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. Well, at the moment, that is, it's a very, very small scale, I would say. So basically, it's been providing mothers with certain skills that could help them to generate income. So, for example, baking, making cakes, making pastries. So a number
There's a
of
particular
others
name of these pastries, isn't it? Is it alfojos or something? The little cookies.
Oh yes,
Yeah, I read about. I don't know what the Spanish name for it is. Just little distinctive cookies that they make. Yeah.
Right. So and as with inevitably with these things, some mothers are more skilled than others. Some are more motivated than others. Some, their circumstances lend it themselves more than they do for others. So some have run with it, and this is providing them with a helpful income. I don't think anybody is at a stage where the totality of their income is being provided by this. But in many cases, just having that little extra, or maybe a significant extra, can be the difference between, abject poverty and getting by. At the moment, we're exploring something on a slightly bigger scale that would involve, job creation in Coyique. But that's at a kind of exploratory phase. But we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I also understand that the kids who live out there, I mean, I don't know how far it is from Lima city centre, but I'm told that the kids rarely go into the city centre. So can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between Coyique and, downtown Lima?
Right, well, I suppose just at a practical level, Coyique would be, to downtown Lima, it's probably a 2-hour bus journey to get there. Now, that's largely because of the traffic. It's not probably, like if you had a clean run at it, you could probably do it in half an hour. It's, I don't know, what will it be? Maybe 10 miles or something, 15 miles. So it's a traffic issue. But yeah, so even just the bus fares there and back would be an issue a family said, well, let's go for an outing, they probably wouldn't go all the way into the center of Lima. So yeah, I think it probably is the case, or not probably, it is the case that lots of kids would, their life would revolve around Goyike. And actually, one of the things we do with the kids is take them on outings, partly because it's a fun thing to do, but partly because it does broaden their understanding of, the city they are part of, the country they live in, and maybe opens their eyes to possibilities that they hadn't previously even contemplated.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the wealth disparity in Lima. I mean, you ministered in Aberdeen. It's it's a rich oil city, or at least it used to be when oil was a thing. Really wealthy, affluent area. Even in Lima, I was reading this morning about the Wall of Shame, and that's quite a common to build a wall between an affluent area and a not so affluent area. Lima itself is, since the 1950s, has gone from 1 million to 10 million, typical of so many majority world cities. Do we in Scotland understand that gulf between the rich and the poor? Describe it to us.
I suppose the bottom line, or one of the bottom lines, or one of the factors is, in Peru, unlike in the UK, there's no social security net of any kind. So if you don't work, if you don't have an income, then you don't have any money. So in a situation like we're living at the moment, where the city's been subject to fairly strict lockdowns over the past year, those who are working in the informal economy, which is actually 70% of Peruvians work in the informal economy. They're not formal employees. They don't pay tax. The type of work they do will be work that they earn what they earn in the day they're working, or in some cases, maybe at the end of the week. So if suddenly you're told you can't go out to work, then you just don't have any income. And so then you're reliant, because there's no social security safety net, you're reliant on family, on charity, on crime, or whatever you can put your hand to put food on the table. It's one of the striking impacts of the pandemic is that Peru actually has been little by little over the last 30 years improving the situation in terms of poverty. So there's been a consistent reduction in poverty. Obviously, poverty is measured in different ways, but by the different measures, there's been a consistent reduction in poverty over the last 30 years. Now, that has taken a dramatic about turn in the last year. I was reading some statistics that from having got it down to about 20% of the population were deemed to be in poverty, as of today, it's gone up to about a third of the population, something approaching 34%. That's millions of people who in the past year have once again found themselves in a situation of poverty as defined by the measure that's being used.
Yeah. Okay. So, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Tell us how OSA is a distinctive Christian organization and how it really differs from a secular, charity.
Well, certainly what we try and do, and I guess we're never wholly successful. What we try and do is everything we do from a Christian perspective. There is to use the kind of jargon, holistic manner of conducting ministry. So whether it's teaching the kids, or whether it's dealing with matters of domestic violence, whether it's distributing food to soup kitchens, we're seeking to do that in a Christian way, not simply by, for example, distributing New Testaments along with the food, though we can do that, but even in terms of how, to give you a real concrete example, the guy who we have hired to be responsible for the logistics of the food distribution, probably maybe a third of his time is involved in conflict resolution. When you're giving stuff away, that creates issues. There's issues of distrust, of jealousy. So his job really is or an important part of his job is counseling the people involved, encouraging them to forgive each other, to reconcile, to work together. And it's really heartwarming for me to hear his stories of what he goes to these places, and that's what he's doing. And then what he does, and this is partly to do with his personality and his character, but then he'll have them all together and says, right, we're going to pray. And then he'll tell them about Jesus. And you'll assure me that many of them have prayed the prayer of faith. And being a Scottish cynic, I kind of think, yeah, right. But no, it is heartwarming to see how something as practical and as, seemingly just transactional as handing over food can be performed in a God-glorifying Christian manner.
Okay, let's talk about the wider context of evangelicalism in Peru. Very often, if you take the whole South American context, the term evangelical is not a great word. It's politicized. It's linked very much, perhaps, with prosperity teaching. Is that a case in Peru, or is evangelical a little bit of a better brand?
I think it's a brand that has been devalued over the years. So even in my lifetime, I would say, like even say 30 years ago when I went back to Peru as an adult, I think there was a general view among the population that to be an evangelical was a good thing, in the sense that if you were an evangelical, you were largely honest, hardworking, reliable, you didn't get drunk. And so people would, even employers would think, oh, well, it would be good to have an evangelical because of those character traits or virtues or what have you. I think with the passage of time, the brand has been devalued, not necessarily because many evangelicals aren't like that anymore, but there's just been this whole mix of these prosperity teaching, evangelical involvement in politics, and maybe, what could we say, very highly publicized falls from grace of big evangelical stars, and so on and so forth. So certainly I would say the brand has been devalued. That said, I think there's still, I would say, I think one positive would remain is that among the evangelical community, there would still be a sense of solidarity among each other, even the different brands or denominations. If you're an evangelical, then you're my brother. And so there's a willingness, certainly in some places, to work together on that basis. That's what joins us. We are evangelicals.
Yeah, what would the boundary markers of evangelicalism be? Would they be, respect for the infallibility of the Bible, the preaching of the gospel, the need to be born again, the belief in the fundamentals, virgin birth, resurrection?
Yes, I think there would certainly be those doctrinal fundamentals that would be shared by those who would identify themselves as evangelicals. This would vary even in certain parts of the country, and certainly vary from denomination to denomination, but there would be certain lifestyle characteristics that some would consider to be essential to an evangelical identity, but not all would share that view. Where there's a big difference is how those who are not evangelicals perceive or identify evangelicals. So for most people in Peru who aren't evangelicals, they would put any Christian church of any description that's not Catholic is evangelical. So that would include Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and sects of one kind or another. Just the fact that they have some kind of Christian identity and they're not Catholic, then they're evangelical. Yeah. Obviously, that's not how evangelicals do it.
Yeah. Would you ever self-describe as Presbyterian? I mean, would that be helpful, or would that be irrelevant?
Again, that would. So when I was the pastor in Moyobamba, I would, but Moyobamba is a very unusual place because probably it's almost unique in being a significant city where the Presbyterian Church is the biggest and most significant and most well known, and that simply wouldn't be the case in 99% of Peru. So it's a very unusual situation. So there, I could identify as Presbyterian, and people would know what I was talking about. They would well, they would know that I was talking about that one congregation in Moyobamba. They wouldn't have a broader concept of the term. In Lima, most people wouldn't have the faintest idea of what you were talking about if you identified as Presbyterian. Within Christian circles or within evangelical circles, possibly yes, but out with them, it would be a meaningless description.
Okay, in the whole of Peru, would you say the church was growing? Is it growing? Is it plateaued? Is it declining? And also, is there a difference between rural and urban?
To be honest with you, I'm not too up on, say, more recent statistics, say the last 5 years or so. I think certainly until 5 years ago, there had been a growth over probably 3 or 4 decades, and an accelerating growth certainly through the 90s and the noughties. My impression, and it's not more than an impression, it's not grounded in statistics or research, is that there's probably been a certain plateauing of the growth of evangelical churches. That's the impression I have. If there's any difference between rural and urban, possibly. There was certainly there's certain parts of Peru, certain regions of Peru where the evangelical presence is significantly higher than in others. So the jungle part, for example, where Moyobamba is and beyond, has a significantly higher proportion of folk who would identify as evangelical than Lima or than other parts of the country. So it's quite a mixed picture, I guess, across the country.
Yeah, I mean, you're bilingual, you're bicultural. Home for you is Scotland, home for you is Peru. You just really, literally, go from one to the other at ease. What would you say the elements are that you miss most about Scotland when you're in Peru? And when you're in Peru, what do you miss most about Scotland?
That's interesting, because it's probably the answer I would give to that question today is probably very different to the answer I would have given even a year ago. I think if I start in the second half of your question, because it has to do a little bit with why we came back at all. So I missed Peru when I was in Scotland. I was happy in Scotland, but I did miss Peru. I had an idea, and this is probably very kind of a bit of kind of therapy going on here, but I kind of had this idea or this notion that I was more useful in Peru than I was in Scotland. Now that's maybe very subjective, but I had this sense that I was. I also, the work in Moyobamba was so broad in its scope. It was, there was an excitement to that and being involved in lots of different things. So I kind of hankered for that. Of course, life moves on, and when you do come back, you discover that maybe it wasn't what you'd imagined. Not that I've got any regrets, but I'm just being honest in terms of things aren't always what you imagine, even familiar places. That in terms of from Peru looking to from Scotland to Peru. Now, kind of thinking about Scotland. Well, obviously, one thing now that's a very real issue is family. You do feel the distance. And COVID obviously has multiplied that. Technology mitigates it somewhat, but I was just speaking to Martha the other day, and at the beginning of the year, and realized that it'd been over a year since I'd seen our youngest son, just because of even though we were back in Scotland in the summer, he wasn't for COVID related reasons. So to have been in a situation where, he was living at home and probably hadn't ever been more than 2 weeks not seeing him, to then going for a whole year, I didn't sign up for that, as it were. So that's kind of, you kind of miss that, not just being so far away, but almost also knowing that even if you wanted to or needed to go, that wouldn't be as a straightforward thing to do. So yeah, I guess, there's a safety and a security about Scotland that's nice, and I look forward to going back to a place that's more stable and more suited to my age. I think Peru is great for a 20-year-old, 30-year-old, but maybe once you're 50 or 60, Scotland's more suitable.
Yeah. We've lost the signal a little bit, but I can still hear you. I've got a great image there of you in full flight preaching. I can get a general, or you're at a general assembly or something. How's that as you back again? Can you tell us how Peru's coping with COVID? I mean, we heard a few weeks ago that it was one of the worst places in the world. Are you coming out of it now?
Peru has coped very badly with COVID, and with that, I don't know the reason for that. Obviously, I could say the government's done an appalling job, and maybe it has. COVID is such a complex beast that sometimes it's difficult to know if, the results are because of bad management or just because, you're unlucky or what it is. But the reality is that Peru has had an appalling experience of COVID in terms of the number of deaths, in terms of the economic impact. It's been devastating. Things were improving, and certainly in terms of the infection rates and deaths in the final quarter of last year. September, October, November were looking good, but then in January and February we had a big spike, and the excess deaths per day are now or were exceeding what they were at the worst point in July, August. It seems to have plateaued again. Then in terms of other issues with COVID, like obviously one of the big success stories in the UK is the vaccination rates and the rollout of the vaccines. Like in Peru, it's only just started. So there's been, I think we've got 1 million doses. So that's what, we've got 30 million people. So you'd need at least 60 million. We've got 1 million, which are being directed to health workers, which is perfectly reasonable. But at the moment, folks like myself, we have have no notion of when we might have access to a vaccine. Even looking towards the end of the year, we might, but there's no way of knowing when that might happen. So that's obviously a big problem. So yeah, I think, COVID has been pretty devastating for Peru. We'll see how it recovers.
Yeah, in terms of your ministry there, can you tell me what makes a great day? I mean, a day when you feel, wow, it is great to be awesome. And also, what are the challenges? What makes it a bad day for you?
Mm-hmm. I think probably the most satisfying days, the days when I would, at the end of the day, say that was a good day, probably are when I'm actually out in Coyique, going up into the hills, maybe when I don't actually have to, like I'm not required to say distribute the food, but sometimes like tomorrow I'm going and I'll be involved in that. And you're kind of at the coal face, you're speaking to people, you're seeing with your own eyes what is being achieved and how grateful people are. And so that's satisfying, that's encouraging. And you begin to see the opportunities in a way that is more real than when you're sitting at your desk thinking what they might be. So I would say that's a good day. The bad days, I guess, are the less good days, or the bad days are just when you're kind of stuck in, because of COVID, you're maybe stuck in your flat and you're trying to do stuff on the computer and you're thinking, oh, this isn't much fun. But you're going, you're doing what you have to do, and kind of getting through.
Yeah. Okay, so we're here in Scotland. We're coming to the end of our chat here, but can you ask us, if you wanted folk to really pray for the situation in Coyique, in Ossa, yourself and Martha, what would be maybe the three big things that you would say, Lord, just help us with this thing, help us to get over the hill here?
One thing that is maybe, hopefully it doesn't sound very memorable, but I think it's important. One thing would be, we're currently really having a careful look at who we are and what we do. That was probably, I think that's always important for an organization to do that. I think COVID has given us almost an opportunity to do so in a more urgent way. And we need to kind of ask the right questions and get the right answers so we know how to move forward. As I say, that sounds all very kind of strategic and all this kind of stuff that can be very off-putting, but prayer that we would ask the right questions and get the right answers. A second thing would be that we would grasp the opportunities that are presenting themselves through the work of the Emergency Relief Project, so that we would identify well what communities we can try and establish a presence in. I think we want to start with work with the kids, so have kids clubs in these shanty towns, and then through that reach the families and hopefully set up Sunday services in these locations, so that pray that would go well. That the two pastors, Tito and Jorge, who's just come on board, would do a great job together with the other folks in the church. That would be a second thing. What would be a third thing? I guess a third thing, we might just pray for ourselves, for me and Martha, in terms of facing the challenges of being far from, I guess I would say at one level far from home, but in other ways at home, and direction as to the longer term future.
Great to talk to you, David. I mean, we wish Light of Hope Church every blessing as it grows and develops. The various, soup kitchens, education work, transforming families. It really is a tremendous work. We'll be putting the URL to OSA at the bottom of our, generation thing here. So folk will be able to go on the website. It's a great website, really informative. Be assured of the interest and prayers of the folk here in Scotland. We do miss you, but it's great to see you. And we hope that you'll be uniting with your family again. Podcast folk, again, thank you for joining us today. This is, I think, our third video as well as audio. So whether you're on video or audio, it's been great to be with you. Please tune in again next week when we hope to talk again to another engaging and interesting speaker as we're engaged in the work of mission. So thank you and have a great day.